Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on the part of the world where you are joining us from. Thank you for joining us in this second day of the webinar series on the ISSB Sustainability Disclosure Standards. Yesterday was the first day, and today we are having two sections, the specific sections on the oil and gas sector and the telecommunications sector. The first section we're having now, which you have joined, is the oil and gas sector. And to open up the session for today, I want to call on the representative of the Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria, Dr. Iheanyibo Anyahara, to give opening remarks. But just before he gives his opening remark, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Antonia Ame with the NGX Regulation Limited, and I'll be anchoring this section this afternoon. Just for a brief housekeeping rules, all participants, I urge you to turn off your mic if you are not speaking. When you have questions, please use the question box to put in your question. If you have comments, you put them in the chat box so that we don't interfere in the presentations that we'll be having this afternoon. So that said, I'll call on Dr. Iheanyibo Anyahara, is the Director of the Directorate of Accounting Standards, Public Sector, Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria, to give us a very brief opening remark. Dr. Anyahara, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Antonia, and thanks everybody. A pleasure having all of you on today's platform. The engagement started yesterday with very good turnout of participants. And this is one of the series, the Financial Reporting Council, in collaboration with the International Sustainability Standards Board and the NGX, to mainstream sustainability reporting, especially in Nigeria. I'm so delighted that we are engaging the oil and gas sector today, because a lot of people believe they are a critical sector of sustainability reporting based on the activities the entities in this sector embark on. And it will be a good thing for all of us to understand how we utilize the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board pronouncements in reporting sustainability activities of this sector. I sincerely appreciate our collaborators, the International Sustainability Standards Board, the SASB, NGX, and will sincerely urge you all to please pay attention to all the discussions we are going to have today, and take it as a preliminary discussion that we believe once the IFRS S1, S2 is released on June 26, we'll also engage further to have a deep dive in sustainability reporting issues. Having said that, I welcome you and ask you to relax and listen to well and down in which discussion we are going to have. I'm so confident from what we had yesterday that by the time we leave this platform today, you will be better off than you joined us. Wishing you fruitful and happy deliberation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Anyahara, for those remarks. Now I'll call on Ms. Tino Adeawe. She's the CEO of NGX Regulation Limited, to give us her own remarks.
Thank you very much. I think I jumped the gun a bit. I'm so excited about today. Thank you very much, Antonia. And I think Dr. Anyahara has really spoken very, very well about what was in our minds when we decided to have these sessions. I'm so excited about oil and gas being the first specific sector session that we're having. I think oil and gas has been in the news recently because of the removal of subsidy anyway. And I also think that when you think about sustainability and you think about Nigeria, certainly you do think it comes to mind. So it's no surprise at all that just a couple of minutes into the session, we already have almost 130 attendees. And I think if yesterday is anything to go by, it's a good session that you're going to have, just, real capacity building. And it's the first of a number of sessions that will be had about this. And so I would say, open your minds, take it all in, and please use the opportunity of the very knowledgeable speakers that we have on board today to ask appropriate questions and to really just start the conversation about these issues, so that when we adopt at some near point in the future, you're already able and willing to be on the train of sustainability and the reporting in Nigeria. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Awe. Dr. Ndidi Noli Edozie, member of the ISSB board, will give us her remarks.
It's my great pleasure to be here today and to introduce Arturo and Corey, my colleagues from the IFRS Foundation, and to express real thanks and praise for the leadership of the Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria and NGX. Yesterday, which hasn't been mentioned yet, the Adoption Readiness Working Group was inaugurated, which is a multi-stakeholder group intended to ensure that the adoption in Nigeria is actually a collaborative process that takes into cognizance the needs of local preparers, but also investors. As you know, the ISSB standards have been written as a truly global baseline, so that really it reduces the cost and burden of sustainability reporting by creating one set of standards that are applicable globally under the same roof as the IFRS accounting standards, which are already applied across 140 jurisdictions. So today is really going to be focused on the industry metrics. One peculiar thing about the standards is that the definition of materiality is the same definition as you have in the accounting standards. The focus is on investors, the focus is on financial materiality, and the intention is to ensure that not just are we reducing and easing the cost and burden of reporting, but we're also ensuring that we're creating a level playing field with proportional measures, of which the industry-specific metrics are a part. So the metrics you will learn about today really provide you an entry point into sustainability reporting. They've been tested, they've been tried. There's an RFI right now on the internationalization of those standards. I would encourage you to check the website and look at them. I would also encourage you to look at the website of the IFRS Foundation and see the RFI on future standards, which deal with human capital, human resources as well, and human rights and biodiversity, and of course, integration and reporting. So this is really part of, and this is where I'll stop, a capacity building process. It's a long journey. It's going to be one that is inclusive and one that is stakeholder-centric. And I would really encourage you to put your questions into the chat, into the Q&A, because subsequently we will actually respond to those questions and create an FAQ so that you can follow through, even if we can't deal with all of them in this session. Secondly, the slides will be shared and they'll be amplified in accordance with some of the questions that you ask. And of course, on June 26th, I want to congratulate Nigeria on being one of the countries where the ISSB standards will officially be launched. Again, hosted by the Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria and at the NGX. So I wish you a good sit back. I see that we have about 150 attendees already. It's really incredible also that Nigeria has opened its doors to allow for other African jurisdictions to join this workshop. And I really look forward to listening to the presentation, hearing your questions, and also your feedback on how we have done well on this one and what we can do better in the future. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for those remarks. So that sets the stage for us to progress into the today's section. But before we call on Corey to give his presentation, we want to gain some insight into what went on yesterday. So I'm going to call on Arturo Rodriguez, who is the manager, Ibero-American Relations of the IFRS Foundation, to give us highlights of yesterday's section, the general sessions that we had yesterday.
Thank you, Antonia. And again, thank you to you for this space and that allows us to continue this capacity building work that Ndidi was referring to. I don't want to take much time because Corey, of course, has a lot of information that's very relevant to the audience. So I will just take a few minutes to go over key takeaways from our general session from yesterday. This first slide shows takeaways from the first part of that session, which focused on the ISSB standards and how the SASB standards fit into that world of the new ISSB standards. And the first thing to note from yesterday is that since its inception, the ISSB has built in upon the principles, concepts, and indicators of existing voluntary frameworks and standards, including the TCFD recommendations, the integrated reporting framework, and the SASB standards. As you all know, the ISSB's first two set of standards will be released later this month, and both IFRS S1 and IFRS S2 have a very important place for the SASB standards. In terms of IFRS S1, which is the general requirements documents, this document references the SASB standards as priority material to help companies identify sustainability-related risks and opportunities. In terms of IFRS S2, which is our climate document, this document is accompanied by industry-based guidance, illustrative guidance, that builds upon the metrics of the SASB standards that are related to climate-related risks and opportunities. And finally, one thing to note from that session yesterday is that it is very clear that the IFRS Foundation and the ISSB is encouraging companies to adopt the SASB standards as a way to get prepared for the implementation of IFRS S1 and S2. Then let's move to the second section of yesterday's general session, which focused entirely on the SASB standards. And we went through some of the history of how the SASB standards were developed. And in so doing, we kind of discovered the value proposition of the SASB standards. So as a way of a summary, let's remember that the SASB standards are designed to help companies identify sustainability-related topics that are reasonably likely to affect the financial condition, the operating performance, or the risk profile of companies working within a given industry or sector. Like we talked about it yesterday, there are currently 77 SASB standards for the same number of industries, and each of these standards highlight exactly these topics that are reasonably likely to affect the financial condition, operating performance, or risk profile of a company within an industry. And in so doing, they provide decision useful information to investors. It's also important to note, as Ndidi was saying, that the industry-based metrics that arise from the SASB standard can be considered as a proportionality measure. Because they focus on a subset of topics and metrics that are important for value creation and that give investors decision useful information. So if you think about it, by focusing on a small set of topics and metrics, it makes starting the sustainability reporting journey easier and thus can be considered as a proportionality measure. And finally, the last thing that I want to mention that we went through yesterday is that there are resources available for you as companies to adopt the SASB standard, just like the ISSB is asking companies to do to get prepared for S1 and S2. And we went through the SASB implementation primer, which is a free online resource. You can look at the URL for that primer in the slides that were shown yesterday and that will be shared later on by the NGX team. So again, just very quick points to summarize yesterday's session. And now I will hand it over to Corey to talk about the SASB standards for the oil and gas industries. Thank you and good luck.
Thank you, Arturo. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. And we'll get started. I just wanted to also say that if you have any questions as we proceed through the presentation, feel free to put those in the webinar chat, and I'll try to pick those up as we go. Any kind of questions that you may have. Today, we're talking again about the oil and gas industries within the SASB standards. Now, they are nested within the sector called Extractives and Minerals Processing. Let me provide, if this will work, there we go. The overview. The extractives contains a number of different sectors, but our focus will be on oil and gas today. We'll look at the sector snapshot just to give you an idea of the context of the extractives sector. We'll then focus then on the oil and gas industry activities, looking really at the value chain and how we parse it out in terms of the industries and the industry standards that have been developed within the SASB standards. Then we'll break down each industry individually and look at the disclosure topics within those industries. We'll talk a little bit about the metrics, as well as how the various industries can nest within one another, in that you don't necessarily have to repeat metrics over and over again if you're using a multiple industry basis, especially for conglomerates or integrated oil companies, for instance. Then we'll look at the channels of financial impact. And then at the last, we'll talk about the actual companies out there that are reporting to the SASB standards right now. The sector, Extractives and Minerals Processing, contains 8 industries. We'll basically look at only these 4 at the top: the oil and gas exploration and production, midstream, refining and marketing, as well as services. But you'll see that there are 4 other industries within this sector: coal operations, construction materials, which focuses on cement production, bricks, gypsum, drywall, those type of materials. Iron and steel industry as well, whether it's a foundry or a recycling mini mill. And lastly, mining and metals. And this last one is actually interesting in concept. As a sector lead for Extractives and Minerals Processing, I'm in a very privileged position as we reach the point of transitioning the energy markets towards more sustainable fuels, away from fossil fuel internal combustion engines towards electric vehicles, for instance. There will be a fundamental shift in the movement of capital towards oil and gas, towards mining and metals. So I have the privilege to actually see that transition in terms of focus for capital markets investors as we matriculate away from oil and gas usage towards more electricity-based transportation systems. And we'll be looking at that point to producers of copper, of lithium, of steel, of cobalt, and these other metals. I know Nigeria has a significant lithium deposits. So you'll see that in the global markets, there should be a fundamental shift in capital away from these oil and gas services as they divest, as the industry moves towards electrification of the transportation fleet. In terms of the oil and gas industry itself, for those of you who are familiar, this will seem very simple. These are, of course, the primary market segments that most companies divide themselves by. The exploration and production side, where we are actually looking and searching for oil and producing it. Then we've got the midstream. Now, this midstream focuses strictly on the pipelines in terms of the industry makeup that we'll be looking at today. If you look at oil tankers, for instance, those will be located in the transportation sector, marine transportation industry SASB standard. So the focus here is strictly around the pipelines themselves. Next, of course, refining the crude oil into refined products. And again, those of you who are familiar with refining will know that petrochemicals and refining are very closely related. In fact, most refineries will have at least some elements of petrochemical production within them. The petrochemical sector is under resource transformation chemicals. But if you actually look at the SASB standards, you'll find that the refining and marketing standard it contains many of the same elements that you'll find in the resource transformation chemical sector. And then, of course, the final customers, whether it's refined fuels going into vehicles or natural gas being transported through transportations to the final burner tip in industrial and residential uses. And of course, underpinning all of this are the oil and gas services sector, which provide much of the labor and expertise to provide for exploration, production, midstream, as well as refining. Initial focus here, we'll start with the beginning of that value chain with exploration and production. You'll see a list here of disclosure topics. These really represent the risks and opportunities that an industry or that an entity in this industry is able to take advantage of, and risks that it needs to be aware of. As Arturo mentioned, the SASB standards are designed in such a way to provide industry-specific reporting. This basically limits the set of potential metrics that a company will report to cost effectively to provide material decision useful information for the investor. We've in this presentation tied these disclosure topics to also the integrated reporting capitals. If you're familiar with that framework, this also falls within the IFRS Foundation. Ultimately, the idea is that in terms of integrated reporting, you'll be able to tie your financial reporting with your sustainability related reporting together in a coherent basis. The integrated reporting capitals include financial capital and manufactured capital. Those are typically what are reported in the current financial accounting statements. But they also include additional capitals like intellectual, social, human, and natural capital, from which companies generate their value. In terms of the SASB standards, these translate into, for the intellectual capital, reserves valuation and capital expenditures. In the social section, you can see the focus on human rights, community relations, business ethics, critical incident risk management, and management of the legal and regulatory environment. In terms of human capital, the focus is around predominantly, not only in this industry and in many others, is workforce health and safety, which of course is very important in the oil and gas sector for those of you who are familiar with the industry. And then lastly, the natural resources that an entity draws upon to create value. In these disclosure topics, we deal with greenhouse gas emissions, air quality, water management, and biodiversity impacts. Now, several of these disclosure topics are highlighted in blue. Those are the topics that will be published at the end of June with IFRS S2, climate-related disclosures. These will be the industry-based guidance to provide folks that are implementing IFRS S2 some guidance how to actually apply that standard. You can see there's reserves, greenhouse gas emissions, and water management, all associated climate-related type of disclosures. The non-climate related disclosures are all of the other ones, and those will actually be following in this internationalization effort with the SASB standards. We hope to publish those by year end for the implementation of IFRS S1. So the IFRS S1 general requirements points to the SASB standards as the primary source of guidance, that you will look at these standards to identify what are the risks and opportunities likely to face your entity based on your business model. You can see the various parentheses at the end of each disclosure topic. Those are the metrics within each disclosure topics. For instance, reserves valuation and capital expenditures. You have 3 quantitative metrics and 1 qualitative or discussion and analysis metric. And you'll see that that's listed for each of these disclosure topics for a total of 27 metrics, 18 of which are quantitative and 9 of which are discussion and analysis. Exploration production is fairly unusual in having 27 metrics. If you look at the total body of the SASB standards, there are roughly about 1,000 metrics in the total corpus. There are 77 industries, so it works out to be about an average of about 12 metrics per industry. But there are industries like finance, health, healthcare, as well as oil and gas, where there is a lot of regulatory risk and a lot of sustainability related risk which tend to aggregate a slightly higher number of metrics. Over on the right-hand side, you'll see some of the sample metrics that I've selected to kind of illustrate where these disclosure topics, how we're informing the information that the investors are actually receiving. For the reserves valuation, you have the estimated carbon dioxide emissions embedded in the proved hydrocarbon reserves. This is a quantitative metric in metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Community relations, the number and duration of non-technical delays, so disruptions to the operations essentially. These are quantitative, number of days. And of course, workforce health and safety. This is a qualitative metric that requires the entity to look at their management systems of how they integrate a safety of culture throughout the production exploration life cycles. With that, I'll move on to the next one. This is midstream. Again, we're looking at risks and opportunities here. Now, midstream is a fairly small segment globally, but it's also a fairly small amount of number of metrics. You can see there's 12 total metrics in this industry, 9 of which are quantitative, 3 of which are discussion and analysis. And those are focused mostly on social as well as natural capitals. We've got competitive behavior, operational safety, greenhouse gas emissions, air quality, and ecological impacts. Over on the right-hand side, you can see I've selected a couple of those. You see ecological impacts has 3 quantitative metrics and 1 qualitative. I've pulled basically 1 of each. The percentage of land owned, leased, and or operated in areas that are protected conservation status or endangered species habitat. And so it's a percentage of area that you would report if your pipelines are going through those type of areas. Ecological impacts, just a description of your environmental management policies and practices, really. And then, of course, operational safety, which is always important, the number of reportable pipeline incidents and the percentage that are considered significant. And those definitions, which are currently in the SASB standards, tend to be a little bit US centric. Those are being internationalized, where we're capturing the essence of those definitions within the metrics themselves to be applied globally. Next, we'll look at refining and marketing. In terms of metrics, we've got 17 total metrics, 13 of which are quantitative, 4 of which are discussion and analysis, qualitative. These are focused predominantly in the social areas in terms of the disclosure topics. You've got production specifications, clean fuel blends, you've got pricing integrity, transparency, critical incident risk management, which is of course crucial in a refinery scenario, management of the legal and regulatory environment, focus on workforce health and safety as always important, as well as of course the natural capital associated disclosures around greenhouse gas emissions, air quality, water management, and hazardous materials management. Over on the right-hand side, I've selected a few sample metrics. Air quality, one of the more interesting ones is the number of refineries in or around dense populations. And of course, those metrics then have technical protocols associated with them that'll allow prepare enough information to apply these metrics as we go through to define what does it mean to be near a dense population? What is a dense population, for instance? Water management, the number of incidents in terms of non-compliance with permits, standards, or regulations. And for those of you familiar, again, with the oil and gas industry, critical incident risk management relies on API 754 in terms of loss of primary containment tiers 1 and 2. These are quantitative metrics that look at these various rates for loss of primary containment or of lesser consequence. Now, one of the things I did want to point out here, if we look back at the slide, you'll note that, for instance, greenhouse gas emissions, air quality are actually common to these 3 industries within the SASB standards. Now, typically, if you look at an integrated oil company, you won't have to report these 3 times. What you'll do is you'll look at the most restrictive instance of these metrics within the disclosure topics. You'll choose that, and then you'll just report it once. Now, a little bit different than, of course, the value chain, the typical value chain for the oil and gas are the services, which I know is very important within the context of Nigeria. In terms of the disclosures that we're looking at here are business ethics. Again, critical incident risk management. This again pointing towards API 754, for those that are familiar with it. Management of legal and regulatory environment, as always, workforce health and safety, as well as some fairly unusual ones in terms of emissions reduction services, water management services, chemicals management, and ecological impact management. This sector, or this industry, contains total metrics of 15. And this is actually a little bit unusual, both in terms of the SASB standards as well as within the extractives, in that only 7 of these metrics are quantitative and 8 are actually qualitative or discussion and analysis. In terms of those sample metrics, you've got the critical incident risk management, which is, again, just a description of the management systems that an entity has in place to identify and mitigate those risks. Chemicals management is quantitative, the volume of hydraulic fluid used and the percentage which is hazardous. This is given in cubic meters, and the percentage is just a typical percent. The emissions reductions in fuels management, total fuel consumed, percentage of it that is renewable, and the percentage that is used in on-road equipment and vehicles versus off-road equipment. So think in terms of trucks and generators for the most part in this particular metric. Now, each of these discussion topics, as you can see, has, again, a mix of quantitative and qualitative metrics. But really what we want the entities out there to think about is when they open the SASB standards, the focus really should be on the disclosure topics. And then you look to the metrics that we think will help you to implement or capture the data that investors are interested in. But it's really the disclosure topics themselves that highlight what are the risks and opportunities for each of these industries. Now, moving on, in terms of financial impacts, keep in mind that the SASB standards were originally designed for an investor. And so we're looking at how does the sustainability related disclosure topic and the associated metrics flow into inform the investor as to the financial impacts, the material impacts on an entity's business model. Now, in this case, I've listed the industries where greenhouse gas emissions are located. So we've got them in exploration and production, we've got them in midstream, and we also have them in refining and marketing. Of course, the industry generates a significant scope 1, 2, and 3 footprint, which means a significant carbon risk exposure. As we go towards transition, we can fully expect governments to begin to use regulatory caps, mandates, penalties, potentially taxes to really target those greenhouse gas emissions. The energy transition could end up stranding a lot of these oil and gas assets, fundamentally reducing the market size as the transportation fleet migrates from fossil fuels to electrification. And it could also accelerate investor divestment as they basically, certain investors either take a moral position or a more strategic outlook on the future of oil and gas for those companies that are not making the market transition, or they don't believe that they're successfully navigating what that transition should look like. And of course, there are also opportunities. Now, I put this opportunities for carbon capture and storage just to highlight we don't have any metrics dealing with carbon capture and storage at this point. But as we go through and we internationalize these metrics, we are listening to the preparers out there, as well as the investors, to make a determination of what information is really needed for decision useful material reporting from the preparers themselves. And this is certainly an area that we're looking at as a potential future project for the oil and gas space, simply because the oil and gas community has a great deal of experience in carbon capture and storage, and it may actually be a part of the business model going forward. In terms of the actual channels of impact on the financials, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, I put market share here, although it's very, very indirect, greenhouse gas emissions lead to climate change, which eventually reduces the market share as the transportation fleet becomes more electric. In terms of non-operating expenses, companies have to be very conscientious about where they're putting that CapEx. In terms of assets, of course, the big issue here are around proved and probable reserves, whether those reserves will actually be producible. And then the last bit, as I've already said, in terms of industry divestment risk, whether investors are interested in staying in oil and gas, at least in those entities that are either successfully making that market transition or those that appear to be lagging. There is one question here. I suggested a Q&A be answered. Okay. The question is, will you be sharing the transitional arrangements for S1 and S2? We can discuss that during the panel. Next, another example of financial impacts. This is workforce health and safety. Now, of course, the industry is known for really striving to manage workforce health and safety and asset integrity to the absolute highest levels. We find this metric within exploration and production, refining and marketing, as well as in the services industry. Now, keep in mind, oil and gas operations are inherently risky. You've always got at least two legs of the fire triangle going at all times. So accidents, although they are rare, can be catastrophic. So in this case, you're looking at loss of life, acute injuries, health problems, disrupted operations, damaged assets, and potential legal, regulatory penalties and liabilities emerging. And then you look at the actual channels of how this would affect the financial statements of an entity in this space. From the revenue side, of course, if you've got workforce health and safety issues, you're talking about disruptions of the operations. You're not producing nearly as much as you could be if you were maintaining proper workforce health and safety. So your market share is reduced slightly in terms of the volumes that you produce. Non-operating expenses, extraordinary expenses around essentially taking care of the workers. In terms of the assets, you can of course have damage to the tangible assets because of accidents, but you can also lose significant brand value for various companies if they're not really looking out for their workers. And probably the biggest and the one that's most common within the financial statements are the contingent liabilities and provisions for accidents and the really taking care of the workers that have been injured in those accidents. Lastly, water management. Of course, the oil and gas industry is very reliant on water for well development, production, and processing, whether it's injecting water into wells to maintain a reservoir pressure or to frack, or in processing in the refining side in terms of heat exchange and steam generation. So you'll find, again, at the top there, the industries that we're looking at are exploration and production, refining and marketing, as well as oil and gas services. Of course, in water-constrained areas, you're looking at higher operating costs. You may look at higher capital investments to provide the water that you need to run your operations. And of course, there may be higher regulatory risks. There is an opportunity here, although there's a lot of technologies that are being developed to offer higher operational efficiencies to reduce those operating costs, even though it may take an investment of capital to do that, and also reduce regulatory risks in terms of the water that's being drawn, used, and then discharged into the environment. Just a plug for the Global Water Sustainability Center in Doha in Qatar, for instance. It was established originally by an oil and gas company and is looking at a lot of these technologies in terms of research and development to really share across the industry as best practices. And of course, water can constrain revenue if operations themselves are being constrained and volumes are being reduced in terms of your production. Operating costs are going to go up if you're in an area that is water stressed. Non-operating expenses, it may require a lot more capital to provide the reservoirs and the flow of water into an operation, perhaps even tapping alternative reservoirs below ground. Assets can be at least marginally underutilized if they're in a water-constrained environment, for instance. And lastly, we'll talk about the SASB reporters themselves. Within this space for oil and gas, we have 197 organizations that have reported over the last couple of years and provided reports to the SASB standards and the metrics in these four industries. Now, they're predominantly in North America, 135 of those 197, but there's a good swath across the globe. Within Africa itself, I've basically pulled the companies that do have a presence and operations within Africa that do report to the SASB standards. Of course, predominantly, I've worked very closely with Shell, with BP, and I've had some discussions with Total Energies in terms of their uses of the SASB standards. These are companies that you can look to. You can actually look to their sustainability reports and get an idea of how they are reporting these standards and these metrics, to get an idea of how you yourselves may implement them in your own financial reporting. With that, I will open the floor to any kind of discussions or questions that you may have. You can put those in the webinar, or I suppose I could, let's see. Antonia, if somebody is able to raise their hand, I'm not sure. Or are we strictly using only the webinar?
Yes, thank you, Corey, for your presentation. So the participant can ask their questions now. Just put your questions in the Q&A section. We'll read out your question. You have a question, I think Corey touched on it, but the question says, will you be sharing the transitional arrangement for S1 and S2? And I'd like to call on Dr. Ndidi to answer.
I see. In terms of transitional arrangements for S1 and S2, this is, of course, a very common question that we've seen across the globe. There's a lot of entities out there that are concerned about a number of things. Scope 3, of course, in terms of that reporting, is not actually provided under the SASB standards, but it is required under the IFRS S2 with transitional relief of 1 year. So in the first year, companies are not necessarily required to provide that scope 3, simply because we're at a point, not only in the oil and gas industry, but also if you look at mining and metals, if you look at many other industries, they are simply in a position where the information systems to generate those scope 3 emissions are very difficult. So the ISSB has made the determination to create a transitional relief for scope 3 emissions. The same is true also around non-climate metrics. So IFRS S2 climate-related disclosures will go out, and there's really a focus on climate in terms of the investor community. But there are, as you can see from the many disclosure topics, for instance, if we go back to exploration and production, for instance. One too many. You can see that of the exploration and production, there are only really 3 disclosure topics that fall under that climate-related disclosures bucket. There are quite a few non-climate related disclosures that are listed here. And eventually those will be part of the overall sustainability related disclosure package. But there is, of course, a transition relief for that first year, the focus being strictly on climate right now. But also to highlight to preparers that in the next stage, we're looking beyond climate to these issues around human rights, around biodiversity, around community engagement and relationships, etc.
Thank you. Dr. Ndidi, do you want to add to that answer?
No, I think that's been very well treated already by Corey. Perhaps just to add that the S1 and S2 are actually built with significant proportionality and scalability measures that are geared towards, especially bearing in mind that, of course, there are significant value chain actors that are smaller entities. And so when these standards come out at the end of the month, they will come out with illustrative examples and guidance that will actually also enhance significantly the ability to apply. There's also a clause for not just smaller entities, but for skills, capabilities, and resources that are available And that will be also further illustrated together with the standards. And there will be capacity building sessions like these ones that are built to also allow for and encourage that transition process. So all of this has been thought about, is being built in to support. We know that this is a journey, and what's most important is just to understand that the idea of building one global baseline is that there are no longer multiple voluntary standards that you abide by, but that first of all, the industry metrics which we're introducing today provide an overview of financially material metrics and targets that you can use as an entry point into reporting. And if you look into S2, for example, which we're starting with, in order to allow for that transition into this style of reporting, there is a range on scenario analysis that begins from qualitative disclosures for those entities that are less prepared. And then over time, the assumption is that you will then improve and become more quantitative in the way that you actually disclose your metrics. And the last point worth making, of course, is that we're moving into an era where sustainability and climate-related risks and disclosures are disclosed alongside your financial statements, so that they're part of your financial statements as opposed to a bulky and independent report.
Thank you, Doctor. So we have another question, which I think Corey may answer this. Is there any special treatment for acts of terror or kidnapping or pirate activities, or are these categorized under critical risk?
Typically, those would be, in terms of integrated reporting capital, a social issue. We don't have a focus within the SASB standards on specific security risks as you're addressing there. They may be, to a certain extent, be considered under the community relations portion here, but there has not been a specific focus on that, at least not in the past.
Okay. Thank you. So there's another question here. Could you speak to the overcoming potential drawbacks from disclosures by oil and gas companies due to unfavorable perception of their actual contributions to climate change? Also, what would you consider incentives for particularly S2 disclosures or oil and gas companies?
Well, that's a very good question. In terms of overcoming the potential drawbacks from disclosures, actually, I see these more as an opportunity. I come from the oil and gas industry myself. I worked in the oil and gas business for a number of years. Fundamentally, the companies that are going to navigate this transition in the energy markets will come out on top in terms of the capital that they will draw, in terms of the innovations that they can bring. There really is no industry on the entire planet that can mobilize capital on the scale of the oil and gas industry and work at world scale projects. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities for these companies to navigate that transition. These disclosures actually in combination with the financial statements. So as a company is really telling its story of how they're going to navigate these risks and how that is reflected in their balance sheets, in their income statements, in their cash flow statements. They're telling a story to the capital markets of how they are going to successfully navigate that transition. Those companies that tell that story more effectively are likely to draw a lot more capital and have a slightly lower cost of capital in that process. In terms of the incentives for S2 disclosures for oil and gas companies, again, especially climate-related industry-based guidance that has been developed based on the SASB standards, which will be published at the end of this month with IFRS S2, provides a set of metrics that oil and gas companies can report to tell that story. The incentive, really to a large extent, is you see that this transition is coming. You've got management systems in place to navigate that transition in terms of the climate risk and the risks associated with it. And if you can effectively tell that story to the capital markets, your reward is essentially access to those markets for additional capital to fund that transition.
Thank you. So we have the other question that is being asked. I think there's an answer is already been tied to that question that says, what are the development opportunities for professionals around these disclosures for professionals outside Big Four firms?
Well, it may be somewhat self-interested, but there is a couple of courses that the SASB originally developed by the Value Reporting Foundation on the fundamentals of sustainability accounting. It's a course I've done the first half of it, which is very valuable to understand how these metrics are developed, the conceptual frameworks in which they were developed, as well as their application. I would look into that in terms of the fundamentals of sustainability accounting. And from my work also in the CFA Institute, there's also an ESG, a certificate in ESG investing, which could be very valuable for individuals to understand how investors are looking at this type of information to inform their investment decisions.
Corey, probably also worth mentioning that the SASB also has a certification program in terms of the industry metrics, and that's also being updated. And there will also be certification programs on S1 and S2 in the future. But as I mentioned in the chat, learning begins with the publication of the standards at the end of June. We hope that you'll find them an exciting read. And they're actually filled also with illustrative examples and guidance in terms of implementation. Again, comfort there is that, you know, housed under the same roof as the IFRS Foundation, they borrow a lot from the accounting standards that we're already using and very familiar with in terms of definitions, and it also borrows concepts from other frameworks that you might be familiar with. So TCFD, for example, and its 4 pillars: governance, strategy, risks and opportunities, metrics and targets in this regard. I'm seeing a question in the chat as well. Why the preference to SASB and not GRI? What happens to the global convergence? Let me speak to that very quickly. So the S1 and S2 and the sustainability standards are building a global baseline. So one of the things that we're working on very strongly is interoperability with other standards and jurisdictional requirements, GRI being one of them. So we actually signed an MOU with GRI. And we're working very closely with them also in terms of terminology and making sure that actually, if you are a GRI user and you're familiar with those metrics, that can actually serve as a platform for you to segue into S1 and S2. The same applies to TCFD. If you're used to that, you will find a lot of familiarity in S1 and S2, or TNFD, where we're also in dialogue. The SASB standards are very important to us because they provide industry-based metrics. So in other words, like you've seen with the oil and gas sector, rather than do a comprehensive materiality assessment, you're already aware of the fact that there is a process that has been gone through to formalize and quantify and outline specific industry-based metrics that you can start from. And because the S1 and S2 standards are focused on financial materiality, those metrics that are financially material to your firm are the ones that you start with applying. But I think end of June, you'll have a lot more material in your hands. Hopefully you'll be happier because of the clarity that it will provide. The assurance that we can give you is that interoperability with other standards like GRI, as you mentioned in your question, are key to us. And secondly, also connectivity between the sustainability-related disclosures or climate-related disclosures and your financial statements is also something that we take very seriously. So hopefully, as a result of that, including the proportionality measures that have been built into the standards that you will see, it will actually reduce the cost and burden of reporting on the one hand, and on the other hand, through more transparent disclosures, it provides the opportunity to unlock capital flows and actually make you more investable, because we are writing these standards for investors and for capital markets. I'm seeing another question. Are there arrangements for sustained engagement on this platform beyond this webinar? We're very pleased to be working with NGX and Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria. As you probably already know, at COP27, it was Nigeria that was announced on the stage of COP27 as the early adopter of S1 and S2. We do see that the Nigerian regulators and also certain preparers have already begun to study and embrace the S1 and S2 standards on the understanding that this becomes the global baseline, especially because under the IFRS Foundation, of course, the accounting standards are already used in 140 countries, and we're anticipating like adoption for the sustainability standards. But thank you very much for these very interesting questions. Over to you, Corey, if you'd like to add. And Tinu, I see you're back on.
Just in terms of the interoperability with GRI, from my standpoint as a sector lead for extractives, I work very closely with the International Council of Mining and Metals, as well as IPCA, the Oil and Gas Trade Association that looks at sustainability-related issues. This question comes up a great deal, and we are working very closely with both those trade associations as well as GRI to look at best practices in terms of these metrics. Now, this will not be in our first step, but as we evolve these metrics, as we find those best practices, we will move towards that convergence, which is often talked about.
Okay, thank you. Lisa White, do you have any other comments as we round up?
No, I don't have anything to add. I think it's been a great experience. Thank you very much, Corey. And I think the questions really allowed us to explore some other things that are of interest to people. I think as Ndidi had said, we are going to prepare FAQs from these entire sessions. And so it's an iterative process where there will be information on an ongoing basis. And to the person who asked whether there will be other sessions like this, certainly, yes, there will be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a great session this afternoon. And so as we bring it to an end, we are going to open up the next section now in the next few minutes. So thank you all. Thank you, Corey, and thank you, everyone.